Welcome to another edition of World Talks on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. The U.S. forces captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife in an overnight military operation, flying them to New York, where Maduro faces narco-terrorism charges in federal court. Venezuela is now led by Interim President Delcy Rodríguez amid constitutional ambiguity, military uncertainty, and divided domestic authority. Regional powers are pressing for diplomatic solutions and a transition process. Joining us today on TVP World to analyze what comes next for Venezuela is Dr. Joshua Phillip Walcott, a doctor of politics at Lazarski University, specialist in Latin American affairs. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me on.
So now we're seeing Maduro in U.S. custody and facing federal charges. In Venezuela, who actually holds the executive authority right now and on what legal basis exactly?
Well, it would be the interim president, who, by the way, she is the first female president of Venezuela, so there's some history being made there. But formally, she holds power. But externally, obviously, the United States, through its blockade, is exerting power in Venezuela. So the power lays with the U.S. through its embargo.
And how does that work exactly? Do you think it's from Rubio calling the shots? Are there any message being relayed? It's really hard to imagine this as the U.S. taking control of a country like that.
It's great that you kind of said Trump then Rubio there for a second. It's really Rubio that is driving the policy here, and I think that's really important to point out, right? Power is being exerted through tweet, ironically, at least on the rhetorical side. But obviously the embargo on Venezuela itself is how the United States is compelling action within the country itself. So Rubio would make a phone call to the first female president of Venezuela and basically instruct her what you have to do, how this transition is going to occur, and she will follow suit. She has already released a review stating that she would like to work with the United States and that she would follow the diktats of the president and the Secretary of State. Right, so that's how power is essentially being exerted there.
Right, but even that statement came as a result of some back and forth, right? Originally, it doesn't seem like she is that willing to cooperate, but then that kind of changed real soon. What happened there?
Well, there's a lot that's going on, behind the scenes that we're not privy to, and I expect that there's quite a bit of hand-wringing in that direction. She doesn't have much choice, right? She's being blockaded, and of course there is the threat of another military intervention by the Americans, right? They could come in and swoop in and take her to the United States as they did with Maduro. So she's afraid. The establishment there is afraid, and they will be compelled to follow, the instructions that Rubio has for the regime there. I think another really interesting thing about Venezuela right now is that what transition is going to happen? How does that happen, right? And interestingly, the Nobel Peace Laureate winner, right? She didn't really receive much backing by the Trump administration, which was a surprise for the Venezuelan opposition, right? So, and the reason for that is because there is an establishment, right? The Chavismo establishment that is entrenched in Venezuela now. So disentangling that and putting in a democratic regime is unmanageable. So they're working with regime insiders to facilitate, let's say, as smooth of a transition as possible. So that's sort of what's going to happen. But
No, please.
I also wanted to talk about, I think, the response of Latin American countries to what is going on. So in Chile, in Brazil, in Mexico, of course, they didn't recognize Maduro's election last year as legitimate. Nevertheless, they had a negative reaction to the decapitation strike, if you will, on their regime, the taking out of Maduro. And I wanted to point out the reason for that is because of historical memory. Right? So in 1954, you had U.S. intervention in Guatemala, 30 odd years of civil war, over 200,000 deaths. You had an intervention in Dominican Republic, lots of deaths. An intervention in Panama, which was not perfect, if you will. You had an intervention in Chile, 17 years of military dictatorship under Pinochet, brutal dictatorship. So they're responding to their historical memory, not necessarily or not solely on the Venezuelan action. So this is where you see that hesitation. They do not want to see the Americans, let's say, laissez-faire or brutal intervention in the regime, because what does that mean for those regimes going forward, right? Is it just now the rule of the power? Is there no international law anymore? These are the questions that we have to answer going forward.
All right, like I say, a lot of kind of power vacuum also invites a lot of instability. So it's kind of a monkey's paw. You could wish for Maduro to be gone, but just to be replaced by another sort of instability. But looking at the general public, the perception, at least that I'm getting, is that people on the ground are relatively optimistic about it. Do you think it has to do with the fact that perhaps they are under a oppressive regime, and at least in the short term, it does seem like at least there's going to be some kind of change?
You know, it's hard to say that there is support. Maduro was not popular. He lacked legitimacy, right? The people of Venezuela were not ever going to support him or defend him. But as I was saying before about this historical memory in the region, American intervention hasn't necessarily led to roses before, right? So as I said, 200,000 people dead in Guatemala. You know, Nicaragua was another example of how the intervention there led to unintended consequences. So I think people in Venezuela, I know people in Venezuela, in Trinidad and Tobago, they are very cautious, scared, if you will, of how this plays out. Inadvertently, this may strengthen the drug cartels, right, which are extremely powerful non-state actors in Venezuela itself. They are hard to, let's say, suppress because they're operating in an environment that is like a rainforest, if you will. So similar to Vietnam in a lot of ways, right? So it's hard to lock down and secure a region like that. And it also explains why the Americans have not gone in through a full occupation. It's untenable, it's unrealistic when you have the heavy rainforest cover. So to say that the Venezuelans support the American decapitation strike is hard to say that. For sure, he wasn't popular, but people are afraid. They're afraid for what happens tomorrow and, of course, in the next 30 years, but we will see.
Right. Another interesting phenomenon is the strong pushback from China when it comes to this decapitation operation. We do have a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China. Let's take a look.
China expresses grave concern over the U.S. forced seizure and transfer out of the country of Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife. The U.S. move is a clear violation of international law and the basic norms governing international relations, and also a violation of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. China calls on the United States to ensure the personal safety of Maduro and his wife, immediately release them, stop subverting the Venezuelan government, and resolve the issues through dialogue and negotiation.
Now, for China to cite international norms, international law, is really hard to believe that that's their only incentive there. I could believe, one would believe that there must be other sort of incentive and motives behind such kind of statements and strong condemnation of U.S. actions. What's China's interest in Venezuela here?
Oil. The short answer is oil. I think about 1 million barrels of Venezuelan crude went across to China. So there's that immediate energy interest. The day before the Americans took out Maduro, a Chinese delegation was there, and there's a lot of rumors as to what exactly they were doing there. Now, we know the Chinese have their own sat-nav, and a lot of rumors are saying that they informed Maduro of an impending military actions by the Americans with their satellite intel being able to see American movements. So perhaps that is what went on. But of course, China has a lot of interest in Venezuela, right? Like energy is their main, let's say, America's ability to strangle energy going towards China is its biggest leverage on China itself. So that's the leverage that it has. And of course, China doesn't want to see its allies in the region fall off one by one. Who comes next, right? Iran, Greenland, Cuba, right? So of course, China doesn't want to see that happen. There's a lot of interest there.
Wait, we have a little bit of time left, and you did bring up a very interesting question. What comes next and who comes next? Do you think that the U.S. administration, Washington, D.C. is going to try to further solidify and expand its sphere of influence? And if so, what do you think the next target might be?
So, interestingly, Rubio has labeled 3 countries in the region, in the Americas region, as an axis of tyranny. Right? So to your audience, this might sound familiar to Bush's axis of evil for the Middle East, right? So Rubio has an axis of tyranny for the Americas region. That includes Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Venezuela's off the board. So naturally, if I was Cuba, if I was Nicaragua, I'd be very worried. The Americans going into Venezuela and conducting this strike must give them a lot of thought for pause. Naturally, I think Cuba is next, possibly Nicaragua. Rubio has said so, Lindsey Graham has said so, that everyone is looking at Cuba. Greenland is also another piece on the board here. Denmark has to be very worried about Greenland. You know, before maybe people might have joked about it. It's no joking matter.
All right, so we'll have to see what happens next. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.